very much for hanging in there with us. And now we're going to move to our final panel of the day. And I'm going to, oh, by the way, I wanted to show the book. This book was presented last night by Dr. Barbara Kohm of the Austrian Economics Center to the Danube Institute. And it's a book that's geared towards a younger audience. It's Hayek's Road to Serfdom, this being this 80th year of its publication and the 50th year since he won the Nobel Prize. Have I got that right, Barbara? And it's got illustrations, and if you know of anyone that needs a copy for a younger person, let us know. We'll be happy to provide it. And now I will introduce Meg Hansen, who will introduce the panel. Thank you, Meg.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Meg Hansen. I'm a senior fellow in the Hungary Foundation's Budapest Fellowship Program and a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute. It is my honor to introduce the three distinguished speakers of our third and final panel, which will delve into utopian quests versus shoals of reality. Dr. Krasen Stančić is associate professor at Sofia University in Bulgaria, where he teaches public choice, macroeconomic analysis, and public sector economics. He is the founder and board chairman of the Institute of Market Economics, which is Bulgaria's first independent economic policy think tank. The second panelist, Mr. Andrew Stuttaford, is a writer, the editor of National Review's magazine column called Capital Matters, and a fellow at the National Review Institute. In addition to the National Review, his writings on political, economic, and cultural affairs have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New Criterion, the Weekly Standard, Standpoint, among others. And the third speaker, Dr. Alex Tokarev, who is originally from Bulgaria, is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and Philosophy at Northwood University in Michigan, United States. He is the founder and faculty advisor of Northwood's annual student-led Freedom Week and director of Northwood University's 45th Freedom Seminar. I would like to invite Dr. Stančić to please address us.
Political, social, and economic reforms are being done by people. So we have the example of Jose Pinera, and there are many people like him, around the globe. And there is even one country which did better than Chile in terms of reforming the pension system, and that is Georgia. Georgia, which is a former Soviet Union republic. I was speaking about people. I have wrote about what I'm speaking today recently for an internet edition. It will be published as a book, soon, I think, by the end of the month. This is forliberty.eu. And earlier this year, I published something of the things I will be mentioning today in my autobiography, which has been published by Springer, and it's a huge volume of libertarian autobiographies. So I will be speaking about population or the generation of 1968. Under this, I understand those people who become socially active in the 60s. So they were the ones who basically changed our countries, including Hungary, into something different. I'm not sure how we describe this different, but I'm sure how we can enumerate, the challenges, the circumstances, and the achievements of that generation. So that generation had predecessors. The first generation of predecessors were the people who militarily, with arms, resisted the Soviet system. And this was a common phenomenon from the Baltics to Bulgaria, from Varna to Berlin. So that generation was destroyed, eradicated, oppressed, and sent to gulags. The second generation of predecessors, of those who were socially active in the 60s, were the political opposition, like the elected officials in post-war Hungary, in post-war Czechoslovakia, in post-war Bulgaria. So that generation was also destroyed, sent to gulags. Not everybody was killed, like the previous one. But some of them were sent to gulags, and even some of them emerged, like Magyar Democratic Party. Some of them who were younger emerged after 89, and become politically active again. So then the next generation were the heirs of the first two generations. So they were socially deprived. They were prohibited of taking prestigious jobs. Almost none of them was allowed to teach. In 68 or post-68 Czechoslovakia, many of the professors who protested the Soviet invasion or the Warsaw Pact invasion were banned of teaching for about 15 years. So, and then there is generation which was somewhat different, from these 4.5 generations or 3.5 generations before them, and this is the generation of 1968. They witnessed the destruction of elites. They witnessed the destruction of private property. They witnessed malfunctioning of the economies. There was a joke in early 60s in Czechoslovakia. There are several ways of going bankrupt. Number one, of course, the most serious and the most probable way of going bankrupt is to try to run the economy of Czechoslovakia. Anne Applebaum, in her second chapter of The Iron Curtain, quotes about 6 or 7 exchanges between ex-communist leaders of our countries, all of them basically saying, the economy is in such a chaos that we don't know what to do. So that generation witnessed several invasions. The first invasion was by KGB with the armies with the Red Army of the Soviet Union during the war. It was 1944. The second invasion was invasion of advisors from Moscow. And the third invasion were, of course, the occupations by the Soviet Union in our country, of our countries, plus the invasion of 1968, and the early invasion, I believe, from which Hungary benefited, eventually. Sorry, there is an irony in history, and the invasion of 1956. So that invasions were absolutely important for the generation of the 60s. Why? Because you will understand the achievement, but they were very important because there was a thing, these people would always take into account. And number one thing they would take into account was that the opposition to the Soviet Union is a dangerous thing. So that's why those people of the 60s, they created a social, not political opposition to the Soviet Union. And social opposition meant a couple of very simple things. You distrust the government, but you not oppose it politically to the extent it was possible. You start preferring things, as a consumer from jeans and home appliances to cars, not made in the Soviet Union, which is simply like good things like Volkswagen. If you are poorer, if you have greater dreams, you like, for example, Alfa Romeo or Ferrari or Mercedes or Audi or whatever. Then it was a tacit opposition, and it was culture. It was culture. You would prefer a movie which was made by Fellini or somewhere in the United States, like Hollywood, or something else, but not, in your own country. Of course, there were exceptions. If you take the Hungarian movie makers, if you take the Czech movie makers, even such simple movies like Lemonade Joe, for example, all that was somehow, in the beginning of the 60s, an expression of a profound opposition to the communist regime. And then you go to music, for example, Lokomotiv in Hungary, or the Plastic People of the Universe in Czechoslovakia. The difference between previous generations and the social activism of this generation was very much visible, but nobody had ever described it. So the generation of the mid-60s could not be dealt away with the methods. The opposition to the communist regime was handled in the 40s and in the 50s. So it was not possible to kill a person who just did like to listen to, for example, whatever, Deep Purple. You cannot control those people in the same way they were controlling the people from all of our countries, for example, not going to the West. So, of course, things changed, towards the end of the 80s and that sort of stuff. But the Iron Curtain was built not because of anything else, but just to keep the people under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. You cannot keep the countries which were opposing, or were thinking of opposing, the Soviet Union, through the Warsaw Pact or the invasion by Soviet troops, like in October '56. So the thing, which was emerging is that the Soviet Union or the communist parties in our countries, they gradually understood that they cannot control the public entirely. So all the individuals were basically left to be with some sphere of freedom. And that sphere of freedom eventually brought about the changes of '89. So what that generation achieved in '89 or in the '80s is something very simple. Number one, that generation had brought about normality in the way of running personal and public affairs in our countries. Normality meant something very simple. That meant restoration of freedom of individual, restoration of freedom of individuals to take care of themselves, actually, freedom of exchange, restoration of private property rights, autonomy, even the public sector enterprises. In '89-90, they become managed like private enterprises. They become autonomous from a government interference. Then that generation privatized the economy. Before that, they decriminalized, and this is very visible in the laws adopted by Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia in as early as 1988 or early 1989, decriminalized the private enterprise. Except for Hungary, in most of our countries, the private enterprise was criminal until the beginning of '89. So, another thing, of course, there were some value-based orientations of that generation. In terms of international value-based beliefs, that generation, because of the occupations, because of the invasions, because of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, because of the invasion by the Soviet Union of Hungary, that generation, be they even communists, they distrusted the Soviet Union. They distrusted Moscow. Eventually, one of the priorities of that generation was to bring our countries into a membership of NATO. And if you look at representatives of that generation, they will hate Kremlin today. They will hate what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I mean, I know quite well Balcerovich, we are friends. I know quite well Václav Klaus. Václav, he changed his opinion several times on Russia, but eventually, now he disagrees with the policies of Kremlin. I don't know Miklos Nemeth, but he is still alive, and you can ask him. So he's 76, like Jose Pinera, okay, and still doing okay as far as I can judge, from the publications. Last but not least, transferring my my points to Andrew, that generation totally disliked central planning. So they knew from the very beginning, from their school years, that the central planning is not working. If they were in the helmets of the political systems of our countries, I'm absolutely sure that they will dislike central planning by the European Union, be this in the monetary policies, be this in the Green Deal, or anything of the area of regulatory socialism. Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Studiford. Thank you.
Watching the clock carefully here. That was great. Yes, central planning is not good, and these days it wears green. First, I should say how great it is to be here. I'd like to thank the Austrian Economics Center and the Danube Institute for arranging this wonderful event. The Hayek, we should mention the man of the hour, he died in 1992, just after the dawn of the age of worries about what was then called global warming. We do not know, so far as I'm aware, what he thought about it. Probably not much. Interestingly, he was something of a fan of the natural kingdom, as were his father and grandfather, and were or are his two children. He was a supporter of the World Wildlife Fund. And I suspect that he would have looked at the science and come to his own conclusions. He would not have followed the science, I'm putting followed in quotes, in a way that we are now all supposed to do, sort of uncritically. And he would not, I think, have been surprised by the way that the idea of climate change has been exploited. I think he would have been amused in a grim sort of way about the way that the naming of climate change keeps changing. Global warming, climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, it goes on and on and on, and is very interesting because one of the hallmarks of, it's not totalitarian, but of regimes with an objective is the way that they change nomenclature. And I have followed with considerable interest the way that the naming of what's going on in the climate, or not going on in the climate, has been described. But he would not have been surprised by the way that it has been exploited, politically and otherwise. The opportunity is too good, and the temptation to harvest it is too great. We're talking about utopias, although I think as utopias go, the green one is about as grim as you can get. Part of the reason that it is proved quite an easy sell is that it ties into very ancient beliefs. There is a great book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, by Norman Cohn, which was written in the middle of the last century, which I would strongly recommend, and he explains how ancient millenarian dreams have so much to do with the totalitarian regimes of the last century. I think that when you look at what people say and what people believe, there is an element of they are playing to old religious themes, and I would include communism and in that category, and sort of discomfort with prosperity, and the idea that you must be punished. One of the most, before you make your way to heaven, one of the most striking things about the Greens is they don't want the comfortable outs. Because every time people come up, for example, we know that nuclear is now very safe. And they don't want it. It's too much of an easy out. They want a bit of punishment. And if you think I'm wrong about this theme, take a look at what some of their people wear on the demonstrations. These are quasi-religious garments. Or, for example, look at things like food. It's all about austerity and completely pointless asceticism. So this, I think, Hayek would have looked at with interest, because one of the things that concerned him, and you see this in The Road to Serfdom, is the way that liberals had been persuaded to give up their principles by the socialist road. As he put it, going down the socialist road because of the promise of freedom. Who can not like freedom? And of course, the socialists redefined freedom. But he says, well, this is what they sort of fell for. They liked the word. And so imagine now the appeal of scientifically backed warnings of an existential threat to humanity. When the UN's Secretary General, he may be a buffoon, but when he refers to a boiling planet, he knows his audience and he knows what he is doing. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek observed, referring to the West, that few planners want to say that central planning is desirable. It's just that they are compelled by circumstances beyond their control. So sorry, got to do it. Never let a crisis go to waste, as someone once said. And adding to the temptation to take advantage of the opportunity presented by the climate crisis, we'll use that phrase, is how great an opportunity it gives to the state, or more generally meddlers, to meddle in an individual's life. In The Road to Serfdom, Hayek noted, referring to the debate in the West, that central planners offered the reassurance, not one you could trust, that their authoritarian control would only apply to economic matters. Hayek rightly did not believe that to be true, but the advantage of the climate crisis is that it spares authoritarian policymakers the bother of even having to make that pretense. We benefit in countless ways from our direct or indirect use of products, services, or amenities that generate carbon emissions. And so there are countless opportunities for the carbon trimmers to intervene in areas unconnected with the economy. I noticed something just the other day. There was an angry person writing about the climate crime of barbecues, which one adds to the endless list of climate crimes. Lawns are also guilty, although their guilt is actually more to do with biodiversity, but lawns are very bad too. The West, as you know, is busily engaged in a race to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That is, the idea is that if we could reach, the planet could reach that by 2050, then we will have the increase of the temperature since the Industrial Revolution will be confined at 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the Industrial Revolution, another extraordinary thing that has happened, is you had a British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, effectively apologise for the Industrial Revolution at one of the COPs, the one they did in the UK. Amazing. Curiously, despite this existential crisis and disaster, a good number of other countries do not appear to be interested in joining in this race. And the West's entry, though, into this race has given policymakers the chance to introduce increasingly burdensome and intrusive changes into everyday life, changes that will become more burdensome. And as we already know, They go far beyond, and are going to go even further beyond, brutal utility bills. Depending on where you live, there are bans or threatened bans on gas ovens, gas heating, short-haul flights, cheap airfares, the sale of new conventional cars. Well, the list already is lengthy, and it will only get longer. There is, for example, the small matter of significantly higher prices for meat and dairy products when directly or indirectly climate levies will kick in. And given the merciless math of net zero, they are going to kick in. They are big sources of greenhouse gas. You cannot avoid it, as much as people might occasionally try to deny it. The other thing to remember is dietary controls or attacks on cars also fit into other people's agendas. A certain category of urban planner, for example, hates the fact that people in cities drive cars. They should be all taking happy public transport. And what a lot of people disapprove of meat eating. And what you're seeing is that climate is being used as a vehicle to get other agendas through. So you might say, well, where's the central planning? Where's the central? Hayek recognized that central planning did not have to be organized through a Soviet-style Gosplan. And in fact, he talks, one of the things, I think it may be the road to serfdom, he refers to corporatism, effectively, of the type that we are now seeing now, where net zero is being pursued by companies, NGOs, and Hayek would have understood absolutely what was going on there. And he would have seen this as an exercise in central planning. And as I said, this is bolstered, in this case, by apocalypticism, by Puritanism, and lurking there, not too far down, is distaste for the achievements of the West. There is also a sort of dislike of the whole idea of growth. Something that I would, for those not looking at this, would recommend looking at, is the concept of planetary limits. There's a belief that, there's a bunch of Swedes got together and agreed, well, these are, I think it's 7 planetary limits. And I think we're in breach of 4 or 5 of them. Still here, but hanging by our fingernails. And planetary limits is just beyond the common sense thing, is an absurd concept. Our Neanderthal ancestors had planetary limits, and they transcended them. And we're a pretty ingenious lot. So there is a degrowth movement, and it's larger than you would think, and it is more influential than you would think. Back to poor old net zero. All central planning's central characteristics, it's top-down, bureaucratic overreach, flawed priorities, no cost-benefit analysis worth a damn, an absence of checks and balances, and all the rest. And of course there's speed. Remember no one here remembers the 5-year plan, but the 5-year plan, the first one, was done in 4 years. It's a race. Deadlines are pulled out of thin air. Orders are barked from above, dissent is heresy. Targets bear little connection to economic, technological, or political reality, and logic is displaced by frenzy. C no longer follows B, B no longer follows A. Those struggling to understand how policymakers can insist on the urgent electrification of everything, or so it often feels, at the same time as they weaken the resilience of already strained electricity grids, and this is particularly true in the US, need look no further. Given what Hayek thought about central planning's inherent flaws, we can be sure he would not have been surprised that participation in this race, a race that a country wins in many senses by losing, is not only well on the way to failing to meet its objectives, but is already doing an enormous amount of damage along the way. And it's not going to meet its objectives. We're not going to make net zero by 2050, thank heavens, because that would be rather like the old comment that Tacitus quoted of the British chieftain, call it peace and you've made a desert, because that's what it would be. And but if you look at oil consumption figures, if you look at what the Russians, Chinese, the Indians are doing, it's not going to happen. But the West will carry on its utterly pointless sacrifice. As it is, high energy costs, some of which are attributed to climate policy, are already sparking fears about deindustrialization, above all perhaps in Germany, where energy-intensive industrial companies have been relocating production abroad. I'll give one dismal statistic. German chemical production, hit a 28-year low in 2023. And those higher energy costs, which of course don't only affect Germany, are not going to go away, at least for any sustained period. In a rare moment of honesty from the ECB, Isabel Schnabel in 2022 said, while in the past energy prices often fell as quickly as they rose, the need to step up the fight against climate change may imply that fossil fuel prices will now not only have to stay elevated, but even have to keep rising if we are to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what will be the consequences of that? Well, in 2023, Hugh Pill, the Bank of England's chief economist, warned that if a rise in energy prices is seen as permanent, it is more likely to trigger greater intrinsic inflation. He was right, of course. If central banks try to get on top of that with higher interest rates, as they should, that's going to slow down the economy. And here we start talking about the Shoals, while increasing the cost of the massive investments needed to pay for the transition. People are told that the clean energy, so-called clean energy, is going to be cheap. It's not. And the economics of building offshore, particularly offshore wind, have been basically put in a very poor place by the amazing fact that interest rates have risen from 4,000-year lows. I mean, who other than the central planner could have been surprised by that? And that inflation has ticked up somewhat too. So all these, the numbers, and that's why I think the Brits had an auction for offshore bids, had an auction for offshore sort of sites last year and received 0 bids. And that tells you that the market mechanism is working, but that they could have come up with the price so wrong shows you they've become disconnected from the market. Even without that, the inflation and the return to a sort of interest rate normality, the distinguished US economist Kenneth Rogoff argued last year that among the reasons for thinking that there would be a more sustained period of higher interest rates were, and I quote, the massive costs of the green transition. And how massive are those costs? In a 2023 report, the management consultants McKinsey, boosters, along with boosters of DEI, boosters of ESG, and of course boosters of the green transition, argued that getting the G20 on track for net zero by 2050 would take investments that could exceed an additional $35 trillion this decade, with about a third of that supposedly coming from business-led innovation and baseline growth. Well, good luck with that. And good luck also with building, let alone finding the money for, the 18 million kilometres of cable that on one estimate will be needed by 2030 alone if net zero is to be kept on track. I mean, you can sort of see the iceberg here, but surely, you say, all that, well, probably not this crowd, all that green investment will produce jobs. Yes, it will produce some. Too bad that most of them are going to be in China, but whether it produces enough net new equivalent jobs in the West is an entirely different question. But surely all that green investment will produce growth. Well, we'll see. Much of it will go on the replacement of assets that are performing perfectly well, but from a climate policy perspective are now viewed as flawed. Such investments, in fact, are little more than spending on glorified repair work of questionable utility, if you look at the windmills, for example. A better question, evoking the French economist Bastiat's parable of the broken window, is, which I hope you're all familiar with, is whether the money invested could have been better spent elsewhere. Perhaps that money can be seen as an insurance premium. Well, it's an extraordinarily pricey one. There are better, more rational ways of facing the problems caused by a changing climate, which are real, in my view, but they're not existential. And we're probably talking about 2.5 degrees, I think, by the end of the century, based on amelioration, adaptation, nuclear energy, and so on. But those running climate policy are too ideologically and otherwise, in many cases, invested in the current model to be easily persuaded to change. One sign, weirdly, that might be changing comes from the electric vehicle the EV sector. The mandated transition to EVs is everything that is wrong with net zero. Let alone the fact that it failed, another central planning moment. Why did EVs fail at the beginning of the 20th century? range anxiety. You would have thought someone might have learned a little thing from that. No one also banned the horse, as far as I'm aware. And somehow yet, this poor, hopeless internal combustion engine managed to win out. Amazing. Markets. It attacks consumer choice. It is expensive for consumers. And for taxpayers and for car manufacturers, it is also expensive, as particularly car manufacturers. I'll get onto the news out of the US shortly. But I expect bailouts are coming. And of course, if it's expensive for car manufacturers are going to shed jobs. And in car countries, so-called, it's going to be a disaster for employment. The car industry for Germany has been described not only as the spine of the German economy, but also the brain. And if Europe's industrial powerhouse, even now, is felled, the political and economic consequences could be disastrous. More shoals. It is also, like much of the Green New Deal, a massive geopolitical misstep, and in this case, a gift to China, where Western leaders look at climate change and see disaster. Beijing, which, like Russia and India, has good scientists, sees a business opportunity. The news that the US is, in an effort to save American jobs, going to slap even heavier import duties on imports of Chinese EVs, is at 27.5% at the moment, is a tacit admission that the switch is not quite so existentially important as we've been told. And we're all going to be boiled alive if we don't switch to EVs. Who cares about the next election? Yet oddly, Joe Biden appears to. It's awkward, but it's a hopeful sign that political considerations are beginning to have an impact on climate policy. And this is going to happen more and more as net zero bites deeper. The deeper it bites, the voters are going to bite back. And the polling is interesting on that. But the voters do need to start at least a few snarls. They are increasingly locked out of climate policy making by courts, regulators, and ESG-infected boards. And they need to start pushing back. And by the way, this is something else Hayek talked about how parliaments were locked out of the decision-making process. And he didn't mean it in the totalitarian sense, but in the detailed sense. So to conclude, in 1979, I attended a lecture given by Hayek. At the end of it was in Cambridge, I'm afraid, and at the end of it, a clearly enraged member of the audience asked Hayek if a truly egalitarian society could ever exist. Silence, a lot of sort of ostentatious ear-cupping by Hayek. Oh, yes, he said, but only at the lowest possible level, at which point the whole audience dissolved into shouting, it being the 70s. But somehow I think that Hayek would have said the same if he'd asked about whether a large modern economy could survive after achieving net zero. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final panelist, Dr. Tokarev.
A big thank you to the Austrian Center and the Danube Institute for bringing this wonderful group of people together. And there is no safer big city, in my opinion, to talk about immigration from the Hoppian perspective, as I'll do today, than Budapest. There are two basic lessons that I expect all my students to learn. One, there is no such thing as a free lunch. That's right. Two, people respond to incentives, of course. All other lessons are just applications of thing one and thing two. Let's see how the second lesson applies to the worst crisis we face today. We witnessed the biggest migration in the history of Europe and America. It has nothing to do with wars and persecutions. Those are not new. What is new? Well, technology is new, and I'm talking about communication and transportation, and public policy. Certain public policies are also new. Millions will keep coming every year, drawn by a simple cost-benefit analysis. Due to modern technologies, the whole world sees that the West offers better economic opportunities. Because of the insane immigration policies of Biden and some EU leaders, the risk of being punished for breaking our laws today is zero. Instead of jails, courts, fines, and deportations, we offer those who invade our borders rewards: free food, housing, healthcare, and education. We give those people unprecedented incentives to come here. Is it any wonder that they move by the millions? If you want to change that, all you have to do is change the incentives. When the costs of crossing illegally exceed the expected benefits, the flood will turn into a trickle. I teach at Northwood, America's free enterprise university. I am a free market guy who learned economics from people like Mises, Hayek, and Friedman. Most free trade proponents think that, to be consistent, they must support free immigration, or another way to put it, open borders for both goods and people. It makes sense. Well, actually it doesn't. And I'm here today to suggest that free trade and restricted immigration are mutually reinforcing positions. Even the most restrictive immigration policy has nothing to do with a rejection of free trade. You may not want to associate or live in a neighborhood of Orthodox Christians or economics professors like me. That does not mean you don't want to trade with them from a distance. Take an online course from me, for example, this summer. I offer 4 of those. The relationship between trade and migration is one of substitutability. If Mexican products can freely enter the United States, incentive for Mexican workers and their families to invade our southern border will be reduced. If America and Europe engage in protectionist policies against products of low-wage areas and in welfare policies at home, immigration pressures will be very high, as indeed they are. What most libertarians miss is that trade and immigration are different in one fundamental way. Let me explain. I'll start with 3 questions that I always use when I begin teaching my philosophy of free enterprise courses. Think about those. You don't have to answer, just think about it. Number 1, what makes transfer of property not theft? Number 2, what makes work not slavery? And number 3, what makes sex not rape? And the answer to all 3 questions is consent. How does that self-evident truth relate to the issues of trade and immigration? Goods and services cannot move unless both sender and receiver agree. I can migrate from Michigan to Budapest without anyone else wanting me to do so. Free trade means trade by invitation. Restricted trade does not mean protection from uninvited goods and services. Protectionism is a violation of the right of private households and firms to extend or deny invitations to their own property. Restricted immigration, on the other hand, means protection from forced integration with unwanted invaders. If I advocate free trade and restricted immigration, I follow the same principle. Both require invitation for people and for goods. Voluntary, mutual consent. Cannot be more libertarian than that. the free trade proponent who supports free immigration is, I'm afraid, intellectually dishonest or inconsistent. Free trade and markets mean that we receive and send goods without government interference. The government's only role is to maintain the trading process by protecting citizens and their property. However, with respect to the movement of people, the government must not permit events to take their own course. People, unlike products, possess a will. They can migrate on their own. Population movements, unlike product shipments, are not per se mutually beneficial. They are not always the result of an agreement between receiver and sender. There can be shipments, immigrants, without willing domestic recipients. And in this case, immigration is nothing but invasion. A government's basic functions, of course, include expulsion of foreign invaders. Immigrants must be subject to the same requirement as imports. A government cannot admit uninvited immigrants. All high-wage areas, their governments presently restrict immigration in some way. However, as we know, these restrictions are very, very different, and there is no consistency even within the European Union. So, which restrictions should a free marketeer like me support? To answer this question, let's imagine an anarcho-capitalist society. Now, most people have no idea what this is. So, in a nutshell, it's a place with no government where everything is privately owned. Every movement of goods and migration will happen by consent. Now, you don't need to believe in the feasibility of establishing an anarcho-capitalist society. I know anarcho-capitalists who don't believe that they will ever see it, or their children, or even their grandchildren. I use it simply as a thought experiment to help us see what a government's immigration policy would have to be if it derived its legitimacy from the sovereignty of the people. A popular government, in that sense, its primary task is the protection of its citizens and their property. It must thus preserve the no forced integration feature of anarcho-capitalism. Because we have a government, we are not anarcho-capitalism. Because we have that government, we also have the institution of public property. And I'm talking about collective ownership by all domestic residents, controlled and administered by the state. The larger the amount of public government ownership, the greater the problem of forced integration. Consider a socialist country like Bulgaria or Hungary after the Second World War, because both of these countries were sold to Stalin by the American President FDR. All factors of production, including land and natural resources, are publicly owned. If the government admits an uninvited immigrant, it admits him to any place within the country. Without private land ownership, there is no limitation on his internal migrations, other than those that are decreed by the government, of course. In Bulgaria, soon after the Second World War, the government could and did very often quarter strangers in someone else's private apartment. This measure and the resulting forced integration were justified because all private houses rested on public land, confiscated by the communist elites. Socialist countries, of course, are not high-wage areas. Their problem is not immigration, but emigration. Socialist countries must sooner or later prohibit emigration and kill people for trying to leave, or they will be left with no one to plunder. Capitalist countries, such as the United States, are favorite immigration destinations. A government-admitted immigrants movement is restricted by the extent of private property. Yet, by proceeding on public roads with public transportation and by staying on public land and in public buildings, an immigrant can come in contact with every American. He can move into most neighborhoods, though probably not near Obama's mansion in Martha's Vineyard. As long as any public property exists, this cannot be avoided. Thus, the government must reduce until it eliminates the quantity of public property in every one of those countries that attract immigrants. It should enforce my right to admit or to exclude others from my property. The more completely this measure is carried out, the smaller will be the need for protective measures such as border defense. You have seen what happens in the United States, in the southern border. The cost of protecting that border from invaders is very, very high. Even Trump's wall won't stop it. Why? Because for long stretches, no private property exists on the American side. To fix the problem, the government must check all arriving persons for a valid invitation by a citizen. Invitations are contracts between domestic recipients and arriving persons. The inviting party can only dispose of his own private property. The immigrant will be excluded from all welfare. The receiver must assume legal responsibility for the actions of the invitee. The inviter must be held liable to the full extent of his property for any crimes by the invitee, well, just as parents are held accountable for crimes committed by their kids while they're members of the parental household. Inviters will have to carry liability insurance for their guests. Now, the invitee may acquire citizenship. The fundamental requirement is the acquisition of residential property, as I bought a house in Michigan 11 years ago. It would be inconsistent with the very idea of invited migration towards citizenship according to the American territorial principle, where a child that is born to an alien automatically acquires U.S. citizenship, as it happened to both of my kids there. As most governments recognize, such a child should acquire the citizenship of his parents. Becoming a citizen means acquiring the right to stay in a country permanently. And a permanent invitation cannot be secured by any means other than purchasing residential property from a citizen resident. Only by selling real estate to a foreigner does a citizen indicate agreement to a guest's permanent stay. And only if the immigrant has purchased real estate will he assume a permanent interest in his new country's well-being. This is a necessary but not a sufficient requirement for the acquisition of citizenship. The sale of residential property to foreigners must be ratified by the affected local property owners. The main point is that Western governments must do a better job in protecting their citizens. We should make it much harder for uninvited persons to enter and stay. It must be much more difficult for a foreigner to acquire citizenship. As it is, all Western governments are pursuing immigration policies that are too permissive. The extent of public property is substantial, welfare provisions are high and growing, foreigners are not excluded, and we don't even practice free trade that we preach. To recap, free trade is inconsistent with free immigration. Consistent with the libertarian non-aggression principle, all migration must be invited and contractual. The solution to our immigration crisis is privatization of public property, domestic laissez-faire, international free trade, and highly restrictive immigration policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Does this work? Yes. Thank you to all our three panelists for delivering very thought-provoking presentations on relevant, pressing issues, but that are also diverse. So in thinking about what factors are in common between the three presentations, the first thing that came to my mind was Donald Trump. He is a member of the generation which is known as the Boomer generation, of course, older than 68, but an important consequential generation that is still running, and my generation of millennials would argue, still ruining the United States. And he, as a presidential candidate, came to power, grabbed national attention and came to power by focusing on two issues: China, for its unfair trade policies, and China is also number one in various green energy technologies. And number two, he focused on Mexico not sending their best and brightest illegal aliens from the open border in the south. So when I think about these things, I think about what the new right in America has become under him, which is protectionism and tariffs. Now, interestingly, just this week, the left-wing Biden administration slapped new tariffs on China, including 100% tariffs on electric vehicles. And so it seems that both the American left and the American right believe that what the concept of security nationalism, this justifies sweeping new protectionist policies in trade and as an industrial policy. This is open to all of you. Anybody can answer. Could you tell me or tell us why are they wrong?
I'm not sure that they are entirely wrong, is the answer to that. It's not the answer to that, but that's my first comment. I think that China is firstly, we have to be aware, before I even say this, that the concept of tariffs to protect national security is a infamously abused thing. And I think that we also have to be realistic about China. It is the first substantial threat to the US since the Gorbachev years, towards the tail end of the Gorbachev years. And in many ways, it is a more formidable opponent, certainly than the later Soviet years. It is sometimes characterized as a communist country. The fact that its ruling party is called the Communist Party may partly explain that. I think it's better seen as a fascist/corporatist model, and it is technologically sophisticated in a way that the Soviet Union was not. I mean, the Soviet Union was pretty unambitious in what it stole. I mean, a few nuclear secrets from Brits, whereas China has a systematic theft of intellectual property, and it wants to be the global hegemon. And the question is, to what degree do the US, or say we, the US, the American citizen, have to help it on its way? Not at all. And I think that the interests, or the national interest, and Adam Smith, by the way, recognized this very clearly, that national interest, particularly when it came to security matters, was more important than what he called, I think, opulence. And so, although I'm a great free trader, I think that there is an exception when it comes to China. I don't think it should be taken too far. But with EVs, my particular obsession, I mean, the 100%, at the moment there are no American EVs, there are no Chinese EVs in America. Volvo, which is actually owned by the Chinese, does have a small model, but that's it. And BYD is building facilities in Mexico, and there's a controversy as to how much they can take advantage of things, how Chinese will they be defined as. But I think that the market for EVs is a false market. It's an utterly false market. It would not. I put Tesla to one side. Good for them. They found a niche. I've got friends who've got Teslas, and that's great. That's free enterprise doing what it should do. No problems with that at all. But a market, a distorted market. Do I care too much if we add another distortion to the pile? No. What I would say, my preferred solution, is scrap the tariffs or the future tariffs. It's already 27.5%, not 25 people say, but that's 27.5% on imported Chinese EVs. Take it down to zero, and at the same time, scrap all subsidies, scrap all carrots and all sticks for EVs. And so let the consumer decide. And I think the consumer will decide. These things aren't very good as a general runabout car, particularly if you live in a city, and let the market decide.
Now, almost anything is better than what we have right now in the United States, in the White House. And I would agree, and with the quote from Adam Smith about opulence and national interests, to a certain extent, and in the context of the presentation I gave, there is a difference between wealth and well-being. It is undeniable that more migrants coming to the United States can help us in all kinds of ways. We'll have more choices when it comes to food and entertainment, and there will be more younger, healthier people that will contribute taxes to, if we don't reform our pension system, Social Security and Medicare, we'll go bankrupt, and younger immigrants might help with that. But just because we can extract financial benefits from the presence of people who don't share our values doesn't mean that we are automatically to be considered better off. Okay? In my case, I prefer to stay in a small rural area of the United States instead of moving to one of those so-called sanctuary cities, New York City, Chicago, or LA, or San Francisco, one of those crazy places. Well, I just don't want to have those kinds of neighbors. Even if my salary in a university in those cities might be double, triple, I don't care. I would rather have a good life. A good life is not necessarily one that has a lot of money in it. Okay, having good people around you is very important.
Very interesting point that you talk about.
Can I add something? Because it was the three of us. 3 quick points about China. China's system is very simple. You have 1-something billion population, and you have 85,000 who are stealing from them, and they have preserve the monopoly of stealing to this, 85,000. These are the members of the Communist Party, the Politburo, and that sort of stuff. Number 2, about the European Union. Whatever you regulate in the European Union, for example, smoking, tobacco, food, photovoltaics, wind turbines, and that sort of stuff. Everything is benefiting China. Why? Because the costs are going up. The European Union is promising, financing all this stuff. So all creates, like with tobacco, it creates, some sort of opportunity, for other businesses in other places. So everything is benefiting China, and I think you had that point. 1 point, 2 points about Trump. Trump doesn't like, economic freedom. First. Second, he doesn't like individual freedom besides his own. And number 2, I don't think, the Trump administration would have been a good administration to determine whether a Mexican or Hispanic or Bulgarian coming, to the United States has the proper set of values. So when the government is determining sets of values, it's a recipe to disaster, and I know it by heart.
That's very interesting because I can tie them all together now. We're okay. Yes. Okay. Go ahead. Dr. Richard Ron has a comment.
Krausen and I have been good friends. I guess it's going on 30 years or more, whatever. I think you're a little bit wrong about Trump. Not that I'm a big Trump supporter, but in terms of, remember, he is married to a woman from the Balkans, not far from you. And he seems very happy with her. And he seems happy with her values. There's this Trump derangement syndrome in the United States, and it's really been taken too far. I mean, Donald Trump has lots of faults. But it's sort of interesting. There were some interviews the other day with black American males who the blacks have overwhelmingly gone to the past to the Democrats. And if suddenly they noticed the number of black American males were going for Trump. And they're trying to figure out what was his policies that they liked. And they interviewed, and one guy says, well, he's a man's man. And that was the thing that was driving. Trump, in many ways, is an all-American boy. He's not going to roll back all the freedoms and stuff. The left has gone nuts making claims about what he's going to do. When he was in office the first time, he was nowhere near as restrictive as Biden's been. Trump didn't try to put his opponents in jail. The Biden administration has cheated and stolen in ways that Trump has never done. And Trump is, yes, you got to separate the rhetoric from the reality. And I think that many Europeans are overly fearful of a Trump administration because they believe the American news media rather than looking at actually the empirical evidence.
Thank you. Thank you. I think about this point where we look at theory versus praxis. We're talking about free market economics, we're talking about free trade, but what people understand, especially in developed countries like the United States, is that the free market caused the hollowing out of American manufacturing. It hurt American men who are men. And this is also the reason that was cited, one of the reasons cited for Brexit, because the Brexiteers said that the EU, as different nations, is hurting, causing the decline of different industries. In Hungary, Hungarian conservatives who are Eurosceptic also say this. For example, they say that the EU hurt the local milk processing industry. So this is what the rhetoric is in the public. My question is, does free trade, free market economics, the Austrian school, following that, is deindustrialization inevitable?
I mean, there is no evidence of deindustrialization. Of course, if I'm owner of, say, Mercedes or BMW, I would try, to produce some of the things, cheaper, and I will probably move a couple of factories, to China or Turkey or whatever. But that's not a feature of the European Union or any government policy here. I don't see any reason, for restricting free trade. If you take, the general figures, so the free trade or whatever, the trade as a percentage of GDP after the World War II was like 25%. Now it is, on average, for big countries, is about 70%. For smaller countries like Hungary, it's like 200% of GDP, or Bulgaria, it's like 150% of GDP. So, and it's very good, for Hungarians, for Bulgarians, or for Maltese, or whatever. Or for Luxembourgers, it's even better because it's 400% of GDP, the trade of Luxembourg. So, economy is always international. Whatever people trying to do with the economy, it's always international. And it has been international even under communism. I mean, look at Hungary. So, why it was called the happiest barrack of the Soviet camp? Why? Because, people were producing something everybody was eager to buy. Be this Tokai wine, or canned food, or cucumbers sent to Soviet Union, there was something like free trade. Of course, it was not very much free trade, to smuggle jeans to the Soviet Union. But eventually I was buying, as a student, I was buying $1 at 25 cents, from Finns who could not spend their dollars in the Soviet Union. And I was buying jeans in Sofia for $7 and selling them in St. Petersburg for $125. So,
Brexit was not because of free trade. The British didn't vote to get out because they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted within the Union. They were restricted. Fishermen were denied the kind of access to the sea that their fathers and grandfathers had before the European Union appeared on the map. And there were many other occupations in which people had to rely on unnamed, unknown, unaccountable bureaucrats sitting in an office somewhere in Brussels, in Luxembourg, in some other country, who will just every day create new rules that stands as a barrier between them and their customers. So we should not be blaming the market for what politics has done. This is something that's happening over and over again, starting with the Great Depression at least.
Yeah, I mean, Brexit. There were a lot of strands of the. I was in favour of Brexit, but I wanted the EFTA, the so-called Norway model, and wrote about it constantly, and was, of course, naturally ignored. But I think there were a lot of issues of sovereignty and things like that. But to go back to your interesting point about globalization and employment in areas hollowed out. There is a very lively, again, I know more about the US in this respect than Europe. There is a very lively controversy about this. There are certainly people who will say that in the Midwest in particular, that the Chinese were responsible, the Chinese exports were responsible for the hollowing out. But there is also the fact of automation. And automation is the ghost of the feast. Because if you look at American manufacturing production, it is up, and it is up very high. But the reason is because the machines do it extremely well. So what are we going to do? Are we going to say no machines? And if you say no machines, you then get the broken-backed British model, which has been hopeless, by the way, since the Cameron government, which is that you import vast numbers of people, and no one invests in machinery. And so what you get is GDP goes up, the small island is filled to the gills with no houses being bought, and per capita GDP, which is the only real number that counts, does really, really badly. Cameron mishandled the economy, they all did. And don't think there's any forgiveness of Tony Blair, by the way, because it's absolutely not. So I think the globalization point is overstated a little bit. There is an element, there's no doubt, and if you look at certain things such as carpets in Georgia, which I happen to know about for bizarre reasons, it's absolutely true. But we also have to ask, what is the alternative? And we also have to say it is the ghost of the feast, and the ghost is going to get one hell of a lot louder, noisier, and more frightening, because I don't know about AI, but as automation goes up the career ladder, and you automate away the jobs of lawyers, you see it also with... Why is the media so left-wing? Well, one of the reasons is that the profession has been degraded over the last 40 or 50 years. So they feel like outsiders now. Who starts revolutions? It's not the peasants. It's never. It's the underemployed intellectual. Lenin never held a job. He just idles away in coffee shops for 50 years, which is why he died of a stroke at the horror of actually having had a job. So the people who start the revolutions are the unemployed intellectuals, or underemployed, and we are going to have a lot of them.
With that, well, actually, I'll just say that sometimes even unemployed, non-intellectual people like Bernie Sanders from my state of Vermont start revolutions. That can happen too. But with that, I'd like to thank once again our distinguished speakers. Please join me in thanking them, and I will close the panel. And now Melissa will give the closing remarks.
Thank you all for hanging in there with us. We've had an excellent presentation today by all of our speakers, and great job by all our panelists, and we're ending almost on time, so yay. And thank you, dear audience. Without you, this place would be very dull indeed. So thank you. And next week, on the 21st, we have our next program, Sexual Violence in Israel and Gaza, on October 7th. I hope you'll be able to join us for that at 6 p.m. on the 21st. And thank you again, dear speakers. And thank you to Barbara Combe and the Austrian Economics Center.